So I'll give you a heads up what we're going to be talking about. First I want to ask you a question. I have a pop quiz. What's the biblical definition of pure religion? Does anybody know? And anybody know where it's found? Okay, it's in James chapter 1, verse 27. It says, pure religion is to keep yourself unspotted from the world and care for the fatherless and the widow. And that's, just as a heads up, that's basically the core of the message today. But I'll be discussing a number of other things along the way before we get to that. Then we'll read that verse later. And then also we'll read the verse in Romans 12:15, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. The title of today's message is, But What Can I Do? Let me get myself situated here. My watch wants to slide off. You know, we might think, well, you know, what can we do in the scheme of things in life? And we might think, well, you know, some might think, well, you know, I can't do much. I'm just a mechanic, or I'm a waitress, or, you know, I'm a bank teller, or whatever. But the reality is, we've all been called, and there's a lot that we can do to help other people and to be there for them. My wife and I and two friends of ours, another couple, went to a seminar in Tyler back here. It's been a good number of years ago now. And we thought it was going to be about the, what's the word for it? When the books of the Bible that are in the Bible were picked out. That's what we thought it was going to be. And I was especially interested in that at that time, in that subject. But when we got there, I asked the guy that was going to be presenting it, I said, you're going to be giving this seminar on, I'll think of the word after a while. Yeah, canonization of the Bible. Thanks. And he said, no, I give that one. But he said, actually, what we're going to be talking about today is how we came to have the English translation of the Bible. And he had 3 or 4 big tables set up front, and they were all covered with different English editions of the Bible. And it was very fascinating. And you can get online, I forget his name, but I think he's a Baptist minister, but he didn't bring in, you know, religion, you know, doctrine, anything into it. He was just there to tell what all transpired so that we could have the English version of the Bible. And there were lots of people martyred, burned at the stake, had their heads cut off so that we could have this. So we need to not take this for granted. But, you know, like in the Old Testament, they didn't have a Bible. And, you know, if people in the Old Testament or New Testament, either one, saw us walking around with this, they wouldn't know what that is. But, so in the Old Testament, they didn't have a Bible. In the New Testament, in New Testament times, they didn't have the New Testament. You know, they could go to the scroll, you know, read the scroll or have someone read it to them if they had access to it. But people didn't have their own scrolls at home. But today, you know, we'll read a scripture here in a little bit, I think, about, you know, the Bible mentions about to whom much is given, much is expected. And it's unbelievable what all we have today. We have the printed form of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, concordances, Bible dictionaries, Bible commentaries, Bible on CD, Bible on your phone, different translations of the Bible on your phone. And you can even go to YouTube and it'll read the Bible to you. Or some it'll read it to you and you can see the script down below. You can read along with it. So we've been given a lot. So we have a lot to be responsible for. And if it's if we're not careful, it's easy for us just to take it for granted. You know, we're supposed to become like Jesus Christ, and to be a Christian, we have to do the things that he did, and we can't just use the excuse and say, well, he was the Son of God, you know, so he had more advantage. Well, we're the sons of God too, and we'll read about that. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. It says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." How many peacemakers do we have in here? I try to be one. You know, we all sometimes do better sometimes than other times, but this tells us right here that we're the sons of God. And let's turn to Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 through 29. Galatians 3, 26 through 29. Verse 26, for you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For as many as you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. That's what we're supposed to do. And we had a sermon in Tyler, I think it was this past Sabbath, and it was about putting on Christ. Verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Does anybody here know who Jay Shetty is? Shetty? Okay, next question. Does anybody familiar with Lewis Howes? He has a podcast. It's called, great. All right, we got one. Yeah, he has some really good podcasts. I haven't heard them all. I can't attest for all of them, but I've seen some really good ones that he has. And he calls his podcast, I think, The School of Greatness. And he interviews different people that have excelled at whatever particular thing and, you know, kind of draws out the secrets of how they have excelled at that. Well, Jay Shetty, and I never knew who this guy was, I think he's about 33, maybe 35 or so, just a young man. And I thought it was a fascinating story. He told on the Lewis Howes podcast how he went to college. He wanted to be an IT guy and, you know, go to work for one of the big companies, Google or somebody. And so he was in college and he was bored one night. And his friend was going to go to a seminar, and he wanted him to go with him. He's like, no, I don't want to go. And then finally he decided, okay, I'll go. Give me something to do tonight. So he went. Jay Shetty went with his friend to this seminar. And the guy that was giving the seminar was a monk. And come to find out, I think he was a pretty young guy. Jay Shetty had always been very interested in how people can go from having very little money to having a lot. So that was his focus. Okay, this monk, come to find out, he had been high up in one of the IT companies, and he decided he wanted to go from having a lot to having just a little. And that whole concept really fascinated Jay Shetty. And so, and he said he hung on this guy's every word like a beautiful girl. Like, you know, he was talking to this beautiful girl and he just hung on every word. And so then he got to thinking about it, and he ended up taking I think he probably had maybe 2 more years of college left. He was of Indian descent, but he grew up in England. And so on his summers off, he would go to India and go to a monastery and live in a monastery there. They had their routine that, you know, they'd sleep on a little yoga mat, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, everybody would wake up, they'd roll up their mat, and they would do their prayers and chants or whatever. And basically, up until noon, they would take care of personal things and have their religious studies. And then in the afternoon, the whole afternoon, the rest of the day was spent doing service projects for the community, whether it's, bringing in water for a village or helping teach at school or whatever. But there's the main thing that I'm getting to with Jay Shetty is, and this was a really valuable point. He said every morning when we wake up, we should ask ourselves, how can I be of service today? I thought, well, that's a great thing to ask yourself. And then, how can I be an instrument of love today? How can I be an instrument of compassion today? And how can I be an instrument of kindness today? I thought, wow, that's a great example. That's something we should all write down and put on our mirror in the bathroom or something and remember to do. Let's turn to 1 John chapter 4, and we'll read verses 11 and 12. And I'll be reading out of the New King James, I think, in all of these. 1 John 4, 11 and 12. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love has been perfected in us. And then I'll just read Romans 12 that I referred to earlier. Romans chapter 12, verse 15. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Okay, let's turn now to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and we'll read verses 8 through 11. 1 Thessalonians 5, 8 through 11. But let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet the hope of salvation. For God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with him. Therefore, comfort one another and edify one another, just as you also are doing. When we edify someone, that means to build them up, just like an architectural edifice. That human nature and Satan's way is to tear people down, tear one another down. We're not of that spirit. We're to build one another up. And now let's turn to Matthew chapter 25. And we'll probably just skip around some through verses 31 through 46. And I'm sure y'all are familiar with this, but it bears being reminded of from time to time. And basically, I'll just paraphrase it. Basically, the heading in my Bible says, the Son of Man will judge the nations. And it's, Christ says, starting out in verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. Verse 33, and he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you by the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer them and say to them, assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. That's always very important to keep in mind when we see somebody going through a rough time, or they're sick or whatever. And again, I'll mention, I always feel compelled to mention this. I'm not talking about enabling someone that's not doing for themselves what they should be. That's a whole nother subject. That hurts people. But when we see people that are doing all they can for themselves and still coming up short, we need to do this. We need to step in and do this to the degree that we're able. And then the other group, Christ tells them the same thing, except, I was sick and you didn't come to me. I was thirsty, you didn't give me a drink. I was naked, you gave me no clothes. And then they say, well, when did we do that? And he has the same answer. Inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, you did it also to me. So that's a pretty good warning. That's a big part of our job description here on this earth. Let's turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. 2 Corinthians 1, 3 and 4. The heading in my Bible, I mention that sometimes because it helps us understand the subject. In verse 3 is, blessed be the God and Father blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of all mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulations. It doesn't say some, it says all. Comforts us in all our tribulations, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the same comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. And that's a really big deal. We all go through things, and we all go through painful things, but we have to remember that it's not just all about us, that we're supposed to learn through that. And when we see someone else suffering through that same trial that nobody knows more than we do, those of us that have been through that trial, nobody knows how best to help in that situation. So we need to pay attention to that. About in March, it'll be 3 years ago, my wife and I had really close friends in the Longview Church in Worldwide about 45 years ago. And really good couple and a good family. And they went on a ski trip, it'll be 3 years ago this coming March, to Colorado. And I had run across Curtis at Walmart a few months before that, and I told him about my wife's diagnosis, her terminal diagnosis, and he was just devastated. And then they go on that ski trip a few minutes later, and he gets what they said was the flu. They take him to the clinic there in Durango, I think. No, somewhere near where they were. The clinic sent him to a hospital in Durango. They put him in an induced coma, and he died. I was sitting there with my wife at home on a Friday night, and I was reading my email, and it said death, the subject line from another church group, and it said subject line, death of my friend. I just couldn't believe it. It was like 10:30 at night, and I called his nephew to find out what happened. And he told me what I just told you, what happened. But and then my wife died about 9 months later, and which this kind of gets to the crux of what we're talking about. But I learned through that trial. And not only did I lose my wife, and this is not about me. I realized, I don't know, within about 3 months after my wife died, that this message needed to be given, but I realized I'm not going to give it because I don't want it to seem like it's about me. And this is not about me. Just leave me out of the equation. But just like, Tyler lost his dad this week, I think it was. Vera lost Ken, which I just love them. And, Ken had, from the first time that my wife and I came over here speaking, it was just clear watching Ken that usually sat right there, him and Vera, that he was a very kind, tender-hearted man. And I just loved that about him. And I loved hearing Vera play the piano and throw the extra liveliness on it. I'm going to miss seeing her. Hopefully she'll come back from time to time. This is not on, is it? I got to push it down where it's not in my vision. But getting back to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, as we go through these things, it's especially our job to identify when someone else is going through it, because we know what they're dealing with, and to help them through that. But that's not only for those that have been through that specific trial, but there's things that we can all do to be helpful, and I'll get to some of those later. But I realized here about 9 months ago, some of you I'm sure know Buddy Brown from the Tyler congregation. He lost his wife about a year ago. And then Benny Sharp, his wife has been in a memory care unit for a few years now. And my heart so goes out to him because he knows what the end is unless God intervenes. But to see your beautiful, very intelligent wife go from being beautiful and very intelligent and very giving and caring to others, from going to that to nothing, is really hard. And people that are going through that and have gone through it need quite a bit of support. But what I found out, and I was not expecting this at all, but in my experience, there's a lot of things that happen that you don't know are going to happen. People, number one, people, even close friends, tend to draw back from you. And rarely ever does anyone mention your deceased mate's name. And the reason is they're not bad people, they just don't know what to do. They don't know what to say, so they don't say anything. And so, when that happens, it's like that person, when you're around other people, it's like that person never existed. And I've got, in my case, I've got 7 wonderful proofs that my wife did exist, because I have 2 wonderful children and their mates and 3 wonderful grandchildren. But the reason I say this is it's helpful when you're around someone that lost a loved one to mention their name. And Christ came and gave everything he had, and which was his life. And he sacrificed his life for us. He lived a perfect life. First he sacrificed being with God the Father, came to earth. Then he sacrificed the whole time he was here on earth, and then he sacrificed his life. Okay, a problem with us humans is we don't like to be uncomfortable. And if we're around a situation like that, we don't, it's like, well, I don't know what to say, and I don't want to say the wrong thing, which I understand that, and I get that. And I know this all comes from a good place, but I'm just explaining it so that we can handle it better in the future whenever we're around those type of situations. And I had another close friend, my longest time best friend. We graduated from Imperial schools together, from high school in Big Sandy. And he and I went out to eat about a year and a half ago. And he told me, he and I, and not his wife, and Ken and I and his wife Sharon, we've been like best friends for 50 years, over 50 years. And Ken told me that he never mentioned Linda because he didn't want to remind me that I didn't have Linda anymore. I'm like, Ken, I think about her all day, every day. It's not like I forgot and you reminded me. So please, everybody's different, but this, you can get on YouTube. Just put it in YouTube, put in the search box, loss of mate. You'll see video after video after video. And they all say almost the same thing. It's that friends tend to draw back from them, even close friends, because they don't know what to say. Or you don't get invited to dinner anymore because they're used to there being 4 of you, now there's only 3, and that just seems awkward. But when a person has lost their mate, which is a person they picked out for themselves, handpicked to spend the rest of their lives with, it's bad enough losing a parent, but losing your mate is on a whole nother level. That's the person that knows your dreams. They know your secrets. They know everything about you. They're, the mother of your children, the grandmother of your grandchildren. So we need to make sure that we don't just kind of by our silence pretend like that person never existed. And I love it. I love it when people ask about my wife. And in conversation, when I'm talking to other people, a lot of times I'll bring up her name because I want to talk about her. And to me, that's a plus if somebody brings her up. And other people are the same way because people are uncomfortable, but part of being a Christian is being uncomfortable. We as Christians have to put ourselves into situations that make us uncomfortable. I don't think it was comfortable when Jesus Christ was crucified. He put himself in uncomfortable situations. And we need to do that. And I'm talking to me too. I'm not just talking to you. I'm talking to me the way I need to be with other people. There's a lady that I've texted with. I first texted her, I wrote her an email in, I think it was April of this year. It was on Sabbath morning, and I was checking my email before I went to church, and I saw this as a prayer request from United Church of God for this couple in Pennsylvania that he has frontotemporal dementia, which is the same thing my wife had, which is terminal. And I sat there and read that prayer request, and I just sat there and cried while I read it because I have a real good idea what the wife is going through. Of course, the husband's going through it too. So instead of going to church, I stayed home and wrote her an email trying to be helpful and encouraging. And then we texted back and forth a number of times because it's a really hard deal, and hers is especially hard because my wife was sweet all the way through, which was a huge blessing. But a lot of people with frontotemporal dementia get belligerent and combative, and that's the way her husband is. And when you're knocking yourself out day and night as a caregiver for your loved one, and then you're cursed at and said all kinds of unkind things, I can't imagine. That would be hard to deal with. And I just texted her a few days ago to see how she's doing. It had been a few months probably since we had corresponded, and she texted me back, and she was telling me that when she goes to church that people, kind of the same thing I was talking about a while ago, after the death of a spouse, people don't want to talk about it. She's going through hell on earth, but nobody wants to talk to her about it because they feel uncomfortable. They don't know what to say. And she said some people will act like they're listening and then, try to get away as soon as they can. And some people will, it's hard to get people to engage. And when someone's going through something like that, they need to talk it through. And they may say the same thing over and over. They may tell you the same thing over and over and over again. But they need to do that. And if you watch these videos, get on YouTube and watch videos, and you'll see that point made over and over again in just different unrelated videos. The only relation is the same subject. little less than 3 years ago, not 3 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, my wife died. It'll be 2 years ago in 5 weeks, January 16th. And the widow, our friends from years ago, of my friend that died on the ski trip, her and another, her name's Melba, so this story doesn't get confusing. Her name's Melba, the one that lost her husband. And then we had another mutual friend from back 40 plus years ago whose name is Dora. And back about a year ago, September, Dora's son-in-law was in the hospital with COVID. And it was really bad. It looked like they could lose him at any point. And so we've had this three-way text thread between the three of us, and Melba and I were texting Dora and trying to encourage her and telling her what a good and faithful God we have. But at some point, I felt I needed to make a point with Dora on this thread that it's not lost on us, on Melba and I, that Melba doesn't have her husband anymore, and I don't have my wife anymore, and we don't know what God's going to decide with your son-in-law, but we can tell you that God is a good, good God. And whatever you have to go through, He'll see you through it, if we walk with Him. Do any of you get Dave on a text thread from Dave Haber? He sends, I get announcements and information from several different church groups, which I like because that I've been a part of, and it helps me keep connected. But back here, it's this past February, I think. Anybody here know Hope Lindrum? Tim and Hope Lindrum, I think their name is. They're from Minnesota, and the husband, Tim, had stage 4 cancer. And they would watch Church of God Big Sandy. They would sign in online and watch services there. And it had been, it seemed pretty obvious it was near the end of the road for Tim with stage 4 cancer. And Dave Haver drove all the way from Big Sandy to Minnesota to spend a few days with them, which I think was just a huge example, wonderful example. And then back short time after that, in his text thread, after he got back home, he pointed out that Tim had pretty much quit eating. And that, I know that feeling, and I know I kept a hospice booklet out on my desk, and it was like, I would refer to it frequently, and it was like right on line. It was just like it said, it starts out, the final months, and then the final weeks, then the final days, and the final hours, and it was right on track. But and my wife quit eating at one point, and I knew, it wasn't going to be long. And so in Dave's text about Tim Lindum, when he said, he had pretty much stopped eating, I knew it wasn't going to be long. And then it wasn't but a few days, and then he died. And so I wrote a text to Dave to try to pass along some encouragement to his wife, Hope, and which Dave forwarded on to her. But if you've experienced a trial, like I said, it's our job to help somebody else through that same trial when you see them going through it. And it was hard for me to write the text. It was a pretty long text because it's kind of hard to see your phone very good when you got tears going down your cheeks. But I appreciated that Dave passed that along to the wife, Hope. And Dave Haber sets a wonderful example of caring for people. my dad was in bad health for several years, and then my mother, was in and out of the hospital. And Dave could be out of town, maybe flew back into Dallas from wherever he'd been late at night, maybe at midnight. And then he would drive not only to home, but would drive on to Longview to anoint my mom or dad after all that. But he just sets an excellent example in that, and something we could all emulate in the way that we care for other people. So when somebody loses a mate or a loved one, the last thing we want to do is pull away from them and just kind of shut them out because we're uncomfortable. Get uncomfortable. Put yourself in that zone where you're uncomfortable. That's a pretty small price to pay compared to what Jesus Christ paid. We're to be a living sacrifice, is what it says in Romans 12. So let's make sure we're there for our brothers and sisters, especially, and not just our brothers and sisters. We're supposed to especially be there for the household of faith, but that doesn't mean we're not supposed to be there for others too. I'm sure there's people in your community that need love and care. So we don't want to pull back from them. When someone loses a loved one, we want to do the opposite of pulling back. We want to pull closer and include them even more. I mentioned a while ago about my friend who told me he didn't mention my wife because he didn't want to remind me I lost her. He's the one, he and I have been friends for over 50 years. I had gone down, they built a successful business, sold their business here a few years ago and bought a yacht, and it was their dream to do the great loop around the Gulf Coast, up the East Coast, through the St. Lawrence Seaway and back down the river system back to the Gulf. And I had just texted him on Thursday, this is back in February, and asked him if they had left on their trip yet. They were anchored on the Gulf Coast down near Galveston. And he texted back on Thursday and said that they were going to leave on Monday because the weather was going to break that day. And he was up on the fly bridge checking all the community. It's a really nice boat. They bought one that needed quite a bit of work on it. He was in the had a cabinet shop, did really good work, and they totally redid their boat. It was a nice boat. It was a 2-bedroom and had living room or the salon and the kitchen and all that. And I went down there and spent a few days with them in January. And anyway, about an hour and a half after Ken texted me back, he was up on the fly bridge checking their electronics and communication equipment, and he had a massive heart attack. So their daughter called me, who lives near them, near Big Sandy, and they have a daughter and a son. The son, who had bought the cabinet shop, he was already down that direction, so he went ahead and left the job and headed that way. So I went and picked up their daughter, Candace, and took her down there with me, down to Kema near Galveston. And Ken was on life support. He was in ICU. And I was down there 5 days with them, and then the family unanimously decided that they needed to take him off life support because he would never would have wanted to live like that. And I concurred. But you never know. And there again, since I've already been through it and going through it, you don't ever get over it. And you don't ever want to tell somebody that's lost their mate, you need to get over this. You don't ever get over it. You can eventually move forward, but you don't get over it. And I don't know, I think some of you, one or two or more, have lost mates I know you've all lost loved ones, but everybody handles grief differently. Like, for example, our son-in-law lost his mother. Tiffany and Dustin have been married for 18 years. His mother died of cancer a year after they got married. And the way Dustin's dad, this illustrates the difference in the way people handle grief. Dustin's dad took down all his wife's pictures. And I'm not knocking him at all. I'm just pointing out that we're all different in that way. And Dustin's dad is a wonderful man, but he took down all his wife's pictures. Conversely, after my wife died, I had gone through pictures, and I went and got a bunch more pictures made and put up. And that doesn't make either one of us a good person or bad person. It just illustrates that we all handle grief differently. And so the thing to do is to be sensitive, because obviously it's a very sensitive subject, but you don't want to say the wrong thing. But a lot of times, most of the time, the best thing you can do if you don't know what to say, and don't just give trite answers like, oh well, a lot of people in the world say, oh well, they're in a better place now. No, that's a horrible answer. It's like, okay, well that fixed that. Now I feel great. I don't even miss my maid anymore. That's not the right answer. But a lot of times the best thing to do is just to sit down, you put your arm around them and say, could you tell me what you're going through right now? And then listen, and don't just don't say, well, let me know if you need anything. Well, what they need is love. They need love and compassion and concern. And who's going to sit down and call somebody and say, hey, I need you to send me some flowers and a card, sympathy cards. That's what I need. No, that's not going to happen. It's our job to reach out to that person and find out what they need and then do it. We should not put the burden on the person that lost their mate or a loved one. We shouldn't put the burden on them to reach out, because that would just be artificial. I mean, you can't tell somebody, I need you to show me you love me and you care about me. A lot of times, when you lose your mate, you lose touch, and touch is important. I'm talking about appropriate touch, not inappropriate touch. And when you touch someone or give somebody a handshake or put your arm around them, your body creates this, what's the word?
Is it pheromone?
Yeah, I think that may be one of them or part of it. That's not the word I was looking for.
Oxytocin.
Yeah, I think that's it. You're the verbalist here, I see. The linguist. But yeah, thank you. But yeah, and that makes you feel good and makes you feel comforted. That's the way God created us. And I've heard of cases of countries in Europe, I think Eastern Europe, where when babies were born, there would be no contact. They'd put them in the incubator or put them in their beds, and they would die. The reason they died, come to find out, is because they had no human touch. They were just isolated. Six weeks after my wife died, my middle brother, I'm the youngest, my middle brother that I was always very close to, we found him dead, apparently of natural causes. And then another friend from a number of years ago was headed to church up in Tennessee, and I had just gotten a sympathy card from her for Linda after Linda died. Well, she played the piano at church up in Tennessee, and she didn't show up at church. They'd had a lot of flooding up there, and come to find out, they found her body in her car a week later. It had gotten swept into the river. And I went to her funeral down in Tyler. Again, this was just a few weeks after my wife died. I went to the funeral, and I sat down in a chair there, And the lady beside me, who my wife and I always felt, you know how when you meet somebody, you just tend to feel like you click with them? Well, I sat down there beside her in the empty chair, and she reached over there and held my hand. I mean, it's not the common practice that, you know, at a funeral you reach over and hold somebody's hand, but I can't tell you what that meant to me. It's that touch, and it's like, I care. I care about what you're going through. And again, I'm talking about appropriate touch, not inappropriate touch. Let me weed through my notes here because I said we were going to read this. I don't think I read it. James chapter 1, verse 27. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. You know, there's other things that we could and should be doing, but I know, I'll just throw out some things off the top of my head that I think of. You know, I've been attending the Church of God since I was 10, and would have been since I was born, but there wasn't a church there. But all my life, I've seen these slick magazines that come. They got, you know, from whether it's the Plain Truth or the Good News or whatever, and nothing against that, but, you know, we're supposed to preach the gospel. But this right here says, true religion is this, that we care for the fatherless and the widows. That's pretty important. It's very important. So, the title is, But What Can I Do? Okay, I'll end this with several things we can do. We can show the widow or widower, which if you look it up, I think you could easily put widower in there too, but show the widow or widower compassion, real compassion. Don't just feel uncomfortable and think, well, I'm sorry for your loss. I've come to where I've hated it when people tell me that. It's just like a flippant, you know, I'm sorry for your loss, then move on. But it means something when somebody says, I'm really sorry to hear about the loss of your wife. And, you know, I miss this about her. You know, I enjoyed this. Engage in it a little bit. Don't give just a pat statement. And do mention their mate's name. And ask them if they could tell you a little bit about them. And again, you know, I think of one friend when he lost his dad. It's been, I don't know, maybe 12 years ago. This gets back to everybody's different. Most people want to talk about it. I asked him about, they'd come back from his dad's funeral, and I asked him about it, and he said, I can't talk about it right now. So, and I understand that. So we want to be sensitive to where they're at, and it's very important, we want to meet people where they're at, not try to bring them to where we are, but we need to meet them where they're at and help them there. Like I think I mentioned already, just sit and listen to them. Let them talk. We don't need to give them answers. They're not needing answers from us. They need a friend and compassion, a companion. Hug them. Hold their hand. Put your arm around them. And invite them to your home to eat often. Make sure you include them more now than ever. And draw closer to them than ever before because they need you. And that's our job.